Welcome back. The CEO of the South African Airways, Vuyani Jagana, has tendered his resignation from the national airline, citing political interference. And where does that leave the parastatal with its turnaround strategy? I'm now joined by Thabang Motsohi, organizational strategist and author who has worked closely with the state parastatals, and Leon Louw, who's executive director of the Free Market Foundation. And they are here to look at the state of the state-owned entities. But I'm going to start first by focusing on SAA, because you've done some extensive work trying to analyze and offer advice to the airline on how to turn the company around. And I remember your initial reaction to the news that Vuyani Jagana had resigned. You said this was to be expected, given what he cites in his letter of resignation. What do you think happened here?
Well, Tim, it's a very sad story, because you may recall I talked to you about a presentation that I made in Parliament in November of 2017, and the question was, make us understand what SAA is all about. And then in April of 2018, they called me back again, and at that time the question was, can SAA be made fit for purpose? I was already 1 month into my 6 months engagement with the airline at that time, advising Jagana. I pointed out at that presentation that organizations that are in distress require a certain approach to transform them. And we all knew in November 2017, I said so very, very clearly, that SA is technically bankrupt. But a decision was made, so I work with that decision. That's a reality we have. It was made that it's got to be turned around. Other decisions were made also in terms of getting the right people, even prior to Jagana coming in. And the effort started. But I said, for this to succeed, you need to adopt not only the psyche, the modus operandi of business rescue administration. You need to have people that can take decisions quickly. You need to let the board sleep. You need to get maximum 3 deeply knowledgeable experts in the field and in the industry to cover Jagana, work with him, advise him, and handhold him to get things done. Because of a simple reason. You need to take decisions fast. That is a highly competitive and dangerously competitive environment. And I'll give you one example. The operating routes are the primary driver of revenues for an airline. If I want to change the CEO from one to the other, or even upgrade or place a different type of aircraft on a route, that's the decision that I have to take with speed. And that's the sort of organizational behavior that you find with Ethiopian Airlines that I know very, very closely. And I've written about them in the book as well. But unless you have that package together in a restructuring environment of that nature, you're bound to fail.
So what do you think happened then in the case of Jagana?
I think what has happened is that really, look, when I was there and even subsequent, he spent most of his time going through the corridors of Treasury, DPE, Parliament, than focusing on the job, because he was demanded to go there. Decisions that he had taken, which were absolutely critical to the turnaround strategy, would take 4-6 months to do. There's one decision, for instance, for the Airbus 350, that has taken over 11 months. Now, in the airline business, agility is the name of the thing. You must respond, and respond quickly. It is as simple as that. Instead of bringing together a whole package, including balance sheet reorganization, etc., we didn't do that. We took a brilliant guy who introduced commercial sense into the operation and just let him go on without support. He needed totally committed support. He spent a lot of his time, as he actually says, talking to the banks, can you give me a slack so that I can pay, you know? When do you do your job?
Well, he does say in the letter, or his resignation letter, that SAA may not have money to pay staff by the end of this month of June, and something that they experienced in January of this year. But Leon Louw, were you surprised when you heard that the CEO of SAA is resigning, notwithstanding the fact that the situation has been analyzed to this extent?
Not at all. And I think he was handed a poisoned chalice, to use the old adage, that he found himself in a position that was actually unrescuable and unperformable. And what we've already heard about the interference of government in the management may be illegal. We unfortunately have a situation in South Africa where our ministers behave as if they are CEOs. They hire and fire staff, which is not one of the functions or powers they have. And he was in a situation, as he said, where there were no clear lines of authority. What's the function of the board? What's the function of the Department of Transport? What's the of public enterprises and of Treasury? Unclear. So I'm surprised how long he lasted and how hard he tried. And if he couldn't save SAA, I have to be honest, no one can. He's a very fine business person. He was committed. But he could not perform, and he should have resigned. I'm sure he thought of resigning long ago. So it wasn't a surprise, it was expected. And in case you don't know this, I have a 100,000 Rand wager with him. I bet against him that he would not be able to get SAA profitable by March 2021. And I should imagine, based on his letter, that he now has to accept that he's going to lose that wager. And I'm pleased to say 100,000 Rand will be going to a charity.
Okay, so you will be collecting.
I won't be collecting, unfortunately. Unfortunately, no, but a charity will collect.
Yes, but I'm saying
I think that I don't think he could ever have succeeded. That's why I took on the wager.
Let me just stay with this point for a short while, because from what you said earlier on, you believe that if certain conditions were met, somehow SAA could be turned around. But there are people who are skeptical who say, you know, the amount of money that is being spoken about here, 23 billion, 21 to 23 billion.
And that's just operating expense.
Yes.
That's not capital.
If you had that money injected into the business, somehow it will be turned around. But, you know, there's a strong view as well that why don't you just give it away?
I think, Tim, you know, my point of departure, we're chatting a little earlier with Leon, is that you deal with the facts that are on the table from a strategic point of view. That's my attitude. A decision was taken. A young, very intelligent, hardworking, smart person was brought in to do the job. He needed help, and I was there to assist him do that. He even had a lot of other help from the UK and so on and so on. But here is the point, and this point that I want to make is actually the main problem with our SOEs. You'll always hear ministers say, yes, they operate under the Companies Act of 2008, etc. And yet, the boards, the constitution of the boards, the way they operate, etc., is none of that. It does not comply with what was contemplated in the Act. So I've made a controversial statement, you know, yesterday that actually all our SOE boards, except maybe for Telco, are actually advisory boards. And if you work on the basis of advisory boards, why do you need such huge numbers? All you need is about 2 or 3 people to advise the minister, because the minister is the one who takes the decisions anyway. If you look at ESCOM, during the time of the parliamentary inquiry into their activities, you know, what was happening there, the changes that were happening, the stories that came out that the minister changed the board from the list that was supplied, a list of capable people that were identified. These are the problems that we're dealing with. We have to be clear as government. What is the rationale for a particular SOE? That question is hanging. And yet we had a study in 2010 with the results coming out in 2012 called the Presidential Commission on State-Owned Enterprises. They produced it, which was a very extensive report. But many things have happened since then. There's a wonderful report that has come out of the OECD on how to manage SOEs, constitutionality, institutional framework, and etc. What we fail to understand is that you need, if you say you're going to have an SOE operating, in the manner anticipated in the Companies Act, you better mean that.
Well, Leon, this is where we are now. The conditions under which Jahana worked, he has already mentioned them. So what do you think should happen to SAA?
Well, let's just firstly say we in the Free Market Foundation have monitored the situation very closely and studied SAA very closely and are of the view that it cannot be rescued. So that's no longer an option. The capitalized, to recapitalize it would be 50, 60, 70 billion. The 21.7 billion which is being spoken of is merely operating costs because it's running at a loss. Every time a plane takes off, it makes losses. Even the so-called profitable routes are actually not profitable because they don't include overheads and lease agreements and other expenses. So our view is you have to accept it's lost, it's gone, it's not rescuable anymore. So what we've come up with is a plan to rescue the brand for South Africa. Patriotic, loyal South Africans want to see South African Airways, and that's actually quite easy and can create more jobs, bring in more capital, bring in efficiency almost overnight. What you do is you offer the brand to international airlines. One or more would take the brand and they would operate SA Airways through a subsidiary based in South Africa. They would then be able to use South Africa as an international hub for flying from South America to Australia or whatever, and they could guarantee the jobs of existing pilots and employees and actually grow them. And so there is a way, almost...
But who would pay 70 billion rands for that?
No one would pay. The government has to actually accept that it must, it's liable
for whatever the debt.
It's liable for the mistake over the debt, and what you do is you offer, you sell to the highest bidder what is of value. Very little is of value. South African Airways doesn't really own any more planes. It's got liabilities, lease agreements. It's a giant debt. And so what you do is of some value is the landing slots, of some value is the bilateral routes and agreements, and you offer those with the brand. So it'll be seamless. People won't even know there's been a change. It'll just be that the owner will no longer be the government. It will now be Emirates or British Airways.
Is it a viable option, you think, under the circumstances, or do you think there are other ways still that can improve the situation?
You see, Tim, I think we're dealing with a difficult situation here because what Leon is talking about, that's what you do in the private sector. That's exactly what you do. I would do exactly the same thing. But here you're dealing with a situation where the state is not coming out to declare exactly what they want to do. I talked about the rationale for an SOE. And I'm not talking about SAA alone. I'm talking about all SOEs.
Yes.
And if we now have to concentrate, for instance, on the top 20, let's define exactly what that rationale is. And therefore, what do you want to do? What is the purpose? What is the objective? Then how are we going to make sure that it happens? And what about the regulatory environment? What about the corporate governance structure of it? And so on. We need to do that. A premise has been set, by the Presidential Review Commission. Although it didn't come to the implementation, it needs to be implemented. So we need a very robust implementation framework to get that thing done.
Well,
that question, when you do that, it will then answer this issue.
And I want us to talk about state-owned entities. And my question is, what are we going to do with them? And how do you turn them around if you want to turn them around? And my guests are Leon Louw of the Free Market Foundation and Thabang Motsohi, author of the book Fit for Purpose. We're looking at SAA, and now we're broadening the discussion to look at all SOEs. Don't go away.